Hello everyone, welcome once again to my channel. Today we are going to be talking about some DBT concepts. Previously I've released some videos on DBT. If you've not watched them, please go ahead and watch them. The first concept we're going to be talking about today is test. I'm going to be teaching you how to build your own custom generic test using Jinja in DBT. Now think of times when you need to write a test for a specific business logic, but you do not want it to be just for that business logic. You probably want to be able to implement that test for some other logic in the future. Now this is when you have to use your custom generic test. The next concept is macros and packages. Think of times when you've constantly written the same logic over and over and over again. With macros, you do not need to do that. All you need to do is write your build your macro, and then after building the macro you can be able to call that macro and use it across your project. Now with packages, some macros are pre-built and DBT provides these two packages. You can be able to install those packages and use the macros in your project. So I'm going to be showing you how you can be able to install the packages and use the macros. The next concept is snapshots. DBT provides a way using snapshots for you to be able to track historical data. I'm going to be showing you how to implement type 2 slowly changing dimension for your data or your model. Then the final concept is your model governance. Specifically, we are going to be talking about contracts and model access. I hope you stay tuned. If you find this project interesting, kindly share it with your friends and your family that are also in data. And please give me a like and a comment, and I hope you follow through to the end. So stay tuned. All right, to get started, the first thing we're going to be doing is talking about Jinja. If you remember, I said we're going to be implementing custom generic tests using Jinja. Now the question is, what is Jinja? Jinja is simply a templating language. It is Python based, and just like Python, you can use Jinja to create your for loops, your if statement, your for loops and keystone. And one good example of Jinja that you probably have not noticed is this right here. So this is basically Jinja. Let me create a new file to show you the simple syntax for writing Jinja. So I'm going to do __ macros. Now, because macros are also created using Jinja, and that is why this came up. But for us, we're going to be creating tests, so it's going to be a bit different. But I'm just going to take it off, and I'm going to explain more later when it's time. So back to test, we have two types of tests, which you are already very familiar with. We have the generic test, which is your DBT native test, like your not null, your accepted values, your unique. And then we have the singular test. Singular tests are written specifically to test business logic, and it is called singular because you cannot reuse it to test a different model. Most times it's used to test a specific business logic. So the first thing we're going to do is to create a singular test that is going to be testing for other revenue. So here the simple business logic is that other revenue should not be negative. That is, we should not have any other revenue that is negative. So to do that, we'll go to our test directory, and then we're going to create a new file. The name of the test we want to create is other revenue non-negative.sql. Now again, your tests are basically assertions. That's to say that when you write or when you run your test, the expectation is that you don't have any value returned. If you have a value returned, it means that the model have failed the test that you ran on it. So I'm going to quickly create our text. That is going to be select all from. So what we had is in this model. So I want to test this model. I'm going to copy the name, replace it here, and then we have what we have is what other revenue. So now we're going to say where other revenue is less than 0, and we are going to save this. Now to test this model, to test this to test the model, what we simply do is we are going to do this dbt test, and we are going to select this particular test that we just created called other revenue non-negative. dbt test select other revenue non-negative, run. Perfect. So our test just ran, and this indicates that we do not have any other revenue that is negative. That is actually perfect. Now, the next thing we want to do is quickly talk on your custom generic test. Now, as mentioned earlier, your generic tests are SQL statements basically. So to be able to upgrade or refactor your singular test to custom generic test, the first thing you want to do is create a new folder in your test directory. So we're going to say new folder, and I'm going to call this one singular to house the singular test we've just created. So I'm going to move this to this, cancel. Actually, I want to move this. Yes, move this to singular. And then we are going to create a new folder as well, but this one is going to be called generic. And now this is going to house the new test we're going to create. So I'm going to copy this as a base, a starter kit for our excuse me, a starter kit for our test, and then we're going to go to the generic. So under generic, we're going to create a new file, and we're going to give it the exact same name, other revenue non-negative, create. Now, like I mentioned, we are going to be using Jinja to create it. Basically, what it does is that it accepts input variables, just like you saw in ref. So let's just quickly go back to this and explain it a bit. When you see this, this typically means that select all from your database, the schema, and this particular table. But you know that I'm currently working in dev, and that's to say that the schema is going to be different for me as it's going to be different from a fellow developer that is working in dev. However, when we are in prod, the schema is going to be the same. So that's one of the cool things about Jinja. It's very good for input variables. So going back to our generic test that we're creating, I'm just going to create it start. So but because we are using test, mine is going to be test, and then here is going to be end test. End test, perfect. So I'm just going to give a space for readability, and then I'm going to paste our starter kit here. Now, if you see here, we have arguments. So this argument is basically saying what argument or what input parameters do you want this test to accept. So the first thing, because we're trying to refactor this test from a singular test, the benefit of a generic test is that you can apply it to as many models as you want. Just like you can be able to apply your not null, your unique, you can apply it to any model at all. So provided it has the same logic that you're looking for. So now we're going to change this here. So let's first change this up here. So what we want to accept first is your model, because here we have from, and then we're selecting from a model. So our first input variable is a model, and then the next is column name. So we're going to change this now to model. So to be able to put model, you see that instead of just writing model, we now have it in your double brackets, your double curly brackets. And then for column name, we're going to have the exact same thing, and we're going to accept column name. And I'm going to save this. Now, before I go ahead to implement this test for our model, something I want to quickly do is I want to disable the singular test that we have created. So to disable a singular test, all you have to do is, I think it takes the same format as disabling anything on dbt. So we're going to write a config block underscore underscore config. I'm going to have a config block here, and instead of materialize, what I want is enabled. And I am going to say false because I don't want it enabled. So basically I have disabled this singular test. Now let's go back to our generic test. Now what we want to do is we want to apply this test that we've created to our model. Well, something that we did not do, very important, is the name. So if you say the name of the test, it's actually very crucial. So we have to change this to other revenue non-negative. If you don't change the name, if we didn't change the name, you would have gotten an error. So save, and then you have to copy the name, and then think the same way you implement your generic test for your models. That is how you're going to implement it now. So we're going to go to our YAML file that has the test implemented for the int others aggregated model, and then for the other revenue, we are going to include it as a test. Now let's go ahead to include it for another variable. So let's go to our model. So we have this called other margin. I would like us to include it for the other margin as well. So let's quickly include it. So we have name, other margin, and then we have test, and then we're going to include the exact same test. Perfect. Now let us run our test and see that it works. Instead of running my whole DBT project or running all the tests that I have in my DBT project, I'm going to specifically select this model, and then I'm going to run the test under it. So let's say DBT build, this DBT test, select. So I'm going to select specifically this right here. So I'm going to copy the name and paste. So we have DBT test, select only this. That is going to run only the tests that are under this model. So enter. Perfect. So you see right here that our model succeeded. It ran successfully. That's to show that we do not have any negative value in both our other revenue and our other margin. This is such a beautiful way to basically implement test. Now, something I should add is that DBT has a lot of tests that are pre-built. So before you go ahead to start creating your own tests to test your business logic, you might want to take a pause and come right here to the DBT packages. Under this DBT utils package, you're going to see a lot of generic tests that have been pre-built. It's really, really important so that you can spend more time focusing on more important stuff. However, if you do not find a test or a test that is specific to your business case or business use, then you can change it. All right, the next concept we are going to be talking about is macros. Now, think of a time where you've had to write similar logic so many times in different models or in different SQL files, and you know how repetitive that can be. Macros are used to write generic logic that are reusable throughout your project so that you don't have to write the same logic over and over and over again. Think a case statement that does some kind of outputting, where you have case when this, then this, and you have to do it again and again and again and again in different files. So what our macros can do for us is that we do that case statement once in a macro, and all we have to do is call that macro whenever we need to do something like that case statement, provided the logic is the same. So we're going to be doing something similar. So for us, we're going to be presuming, or we're going to create an assumption in our head that cost here and retail price is in cents. So we have cost and then we have retail price. They're actually not in cents, but for the sake of this tutorial or this demo, I'm going to convert them to dollars. Now, so we have cost and then we have retail price. So if I were to convert them to dollars, if they were in cent, I'll most likely do like a divide by 100, and then I'm going to do the same thing here as well, divide by 100. However, I don't want to do that. I don't want to have to do the same conversion over and over again, the same rounding over and over again. So I could actually create a macro for this and then just call it. So to create a macro, we are going to go to our macros directory here, and we are going to create a new file. Now the name of our file, we're going to call it cent to dollars and save. Now as usual, we're just going to do underscore underscore macro and then pick this up, and it's going to give us the syntax. This is our start tag and this is our end tag. If you recall, the previous time we had test here, but now it's macro. So the first thing is the name of the macro, which is cent to dollars. Yes, and for now I'm just going to take out the argument. So something I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this as a base for us. So all I need is from here. So if I copy this, so we see that cost is now divided by 100 and it is rounded to 4 decimal places, and I am going to save it. After saving it, if I want to call this macro, all I have to do is take this up. So go back to my notes or to the model. So we're going to open here, and then we're going to have two curly brackets. We're now going to do cents to dollars and call it. So let's call this as new cost, comma. All right, so now we have just called the macro that we created. Let's compile this and see what it gives us. Perfect. So the first thing we have is ID, that's product ID, and we see our product ID here. And then the next thing we have is the cost we initially had, which we can see here as well. Then the next thing we can see is our new cost. If you see, it has the exact same formula as this cost here. But then two things. One, it has a lot of space. It has a lot of space between this, and we don't want that. So I'm just going to quickly go back to our cent dollars. One of the ways to remove space in your macro or in your Jinja is come here and you put like a minus sign just before the percent sign. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to save. So if I go back here, I'm going to compile again. So I'm going to compile again. So because I had it highlighted, that was why it was compiling only what I had highlighted. So I have to take off my cursor. All right, cool. So now we see that we have this space. That's the white space is out. All right. The next thing we want to do now is that if you see, the whole point of macros is to not write the same thing over and over again. But the thing is that we cannot put retail price to this macro here, or if we cannot implement it yet for this retail price because currently the name of this column, that's cost, is embedded in it. So what we want to do is that we want to put input variables such that it can be able to accept variables, and then we can be able to call it. So let's go back to our cent to dollars macro, and then we're going to call the column name as the input variable. So here we're now going to have your double bracket and column name. I always like to give space. This is for readability. Perfect. And then I'm going to save again. So since we have an input variable here, it means that now we can be able to apply this to any field that we want to apply it to, provided they share the same logic. So let's go back to our model. So what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to call this column cost. And when you want to call the column cost, make sure to put it or to wrap it in double quotation mark, else DBT will think that there is a variable called cost. Now, after applying this, I want to now be able to apply it also to our retail price. I'm going to name this new retail price. Okay, and let us preview. Cool. So we see now that our new colors and our retail price, they're basically sharing the same macro. And you can also see that when it is compiled in DBT compiles it to actually show the underlying code in the macro. Now, one final thing we want to do is we have the round function, rounding this to 4 decimal places. But what if we want to allow any user to be able to use any decimal place of their choice? So we can do that by simply going back to our macro and also adding that as an input variable. So let's go here and we're going to say decimal is equal to 4. So we're saying that decimal, the default number of decimals should be 4 places, but if we do not provide 4, then you can, if we do not provide a decimal place, like the user did not provide any decimal place, then it's going to default to 4. So we are now going to call decimal here. So let's put decimals. And then space for readability. Perfect, and save. And let's go back here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use different decimal places for the both of them. So for this one, let's leave it without putting anything. And for this, let us put 2. And then let us compile to see. I hope I'm not highlighting anything. So compile. All right, perfect. So you see that the one where we did not include a decimal, it defaults to 4. And then the one where we included 2, it chose 2 as a decimal. So this is basically how to create a macro. Now, one more thing, macros, you can also document your macro so that anyone that is using your macro can be able to understand how it's being used and what arguments it basically accepts. So I'm going to create a new file under macros, of course, and I'm going to call it underscore macros underscore docs.yaml. So here I'm going to say macros. And the name of our macro is sent to dollars. Because I put like a description. All right. And then something else we can do is also arguments. So the first argument is column name, and then another argument here set is decimals. All right, we're going to save this. You can also go ahead to include the data type of the arguments. So we're going to save this, and then we are going to move on. So now this is how you implement your macros basically. But let's quickly talk about packages. DBT has a lot of macros that have been pre-built by other developers that you can make use of freely without having to pay any amount whatsoever. And to be able to use these packages, all you have to be able to use these macros, all you have to do is you have to install the packages. So we have different types of packages. For you to be able to install packages, the first thing you want to do is create a YAML file, a packages.yaml file. But I already have one package installed. So I'm going to walk you through how to install a different package. So let's quickly open DBT. So this is the package I want to install, and I'm going to show you how to use it as well. So I'm going to copy this. And I'm going to take this off since we already have that up. So since I'm installing a new one, I'm just going to save. And all you have to do is run dbt deps. So when you run dbt deps, it's going to install this new package for us. So let's run that. Alright, our package has been installed. So now let's go ahead to see the different macros we have under this package and how to use some of them. Let's go back to our macro. Okay, this is Gen. So let's go here. The first one I want to use is something that I've utilized in the past and I honestly like to use it. That is the one that has to do with generating surrogate keys. So I'm going to open it. This one basically is if you're writing or if you're creating a model and the model does not have like a surrogate or like a primary key. So you could combine more than one column or two columns and create a surrogate key. So let's do that. It typically works like your concat, how your concat in SQL works. That is basically how it works. So let's look for it. Let's look for generate surrogate key. Perfect. So this is it basically. I'm just going to copy it. And let's go to our project. So I'm just going to open this model. We are going to utilize it here. So I want to create a surrogate key here. We're going to see how it works. So to be able to use it, basically, you just put this and then you put in the field name. So for me, I'm going to use ID. I'm going to use order ID. And try it. Okay, let me add one more. I could also add user ID. And let us compile. Oh yeah, sorry, it's going to give an error as new key. All right, let's compile again. Oh yeah, I think I missed the square brackets. Is that where it is? This is, no, it's not here. It is here. All right, compile again. Perfect. So basically, this is how you utilize um, a package from DBT, or a macro rather, to be able to like do repetitive tasks. Basically, if you have to create a surrogate key over and over and over again in your tasks, or even if you have to just create it once, you could quickly just use this one instead of having to write your own macro and then utilizing it. Now, something or another one that I really like, this one is from CodeGen. It's used for generating your models in YAML. You know how tedious sometimes it can be trying to create a YAML? Yeah, that is something that you could basically utilize, and it's pretty fast. So this is your CodeGen package. I already have it installed, and this is it here. So where is it? Generate. I hope I clicked on the right thing. I think I did. Let's go up. So generate model YAML. All right, so this is it. I'm just going to copy it, and you see how fast it is in creating your model, your YAMLs for you, your YAML documentation. So let's open a new file. I'm going to paste it here. Then all the input variable it needs is just the column name basically. So I'm going to copy all the column names in my staging directory. All right, let us preview. Perfect. So this is basically how to utilize the different kinds of packages in your DBT project to make it really easy and fast. So you can basically just copy this, take it to your YAML file, and then edit as it is necessary. Then we are going to be talking about is type 2 slowly changing dimensions. DBT provides a way to be able to implement or track historical data over time for mutable data sources. Now, I'm going to be using this staging table to explain it. Now look at the records we have in our staging table. We can see that it has like an other status, and for this particular table it seems like the other status is being overwritten every time it changes. And then we have like timestamps that basically updates, so it goes from null to the timestamp it happened. So I'm going to try to query for a particular, let's say query for other status complete, so that we would see. So let's say where ID is equal to this, and then let's preview this. Yeah, so we see that this order is complete, but we do not see the previous states of the order. And this is not great, because a lot of times the importance of tracking historical data is to be able to, especially if it's something that you want to be able to report on, you could report a lot of things on it. But we can see that this is just complete. It does not show when it was processed. It does not show any of that. However, it does show like timestamps. But now we're going to use this table to implement type 2 slowly changing dimensions using snapshots. So the first thing to do is to create a file. Go to your snapshots directory and create a new file. and we're going to call this file other status snapshots.yaml. So this is basically how you create it. So to continue, I'm going to open dbt docs so that we can copy. So this is dbt doc. This is basically how you can configure your snapshots in dbt. Now, a few things you should take note of is that, first of all, there are two strategies basically for implementing snapshots. The first one is timestamp, and let me see if we go here. This is strategy, and it says timestamp and it says check. So timestamp is if you have a reliable timestamp, you can use it to determine if a role has changed, and it is best when you have an updated at field that updates when the status is actually updated. But if you don't have that, then I think your next bet is to use your check strategy, which uses a list of columns that is provided to compare current and historical values to determine if a role has changed. So I'm just going to copy this, and we're going to quickly paste it. And we're going to rename our snapshot, which is going to be the name of the snapshot in the snapshot directory. So other status snapshot.yaml, paste. Then relation, that's basically the name of the model that the snapshot is going to be referencing, or the source data basically. So we are going to copy our other items model, staging model, and then we're going to replace model. Great. All right, then we're going to quickly add a description. Other status snapshot table. Cool. Done with that. Then database. This we're going to take it off simply because we want the snapshots to be in the same database that our other models that we've created is. However, we are going to change the schema. It's actually best practice that your schema is different from your analytics. Simple reason is because so that someone would not mistakenly drop it, especially because snapshots cannot be recreated. So you want it different, and so that someone can easily identify that it's a snapshot. So we are going to rename it snapshots. Then we have alias. Then we have the strategy, which we're going to be using check. Then unique key. Our unique key is going to be ID. Then the next thing is the check call. So the all simply means if you want to use all the columns as the columns to reference basically. So we're going to use ID, order ID, and finally order status. Cool. Then the next thing is the update data, which we don't need because we only need that if we're using the timestamp strategy. Then the next thing is the snapshots meta column names, which we're going to take out. You can customize that. Then for dbt valid to current, so basically this is typically null when you do not put anything. So your snapshot is going to be showing null because we're going to put something here. Whenever we update our snapshot, the most current value is going to have this date as the dbt valid to. So we're going to cast as timestamp because he expects a timestamp. And the next one is hard delete. This basically tells dbt what to do when a record is deleted from the database, if you should ignore it or anything. So I'm just going to say ignore. Then we are going to save. Just to confirm before we save, all the status rev, all the status snapshot table, the check ID, check columns, then our dbt valid to current, then we have our hard delete ignore. So we're now going to run our DBT snapshot to basically run our, or to snapshot our snapshot. Oops, it ran into an error because we did not save, so I'm just going to run that again. Perfect. So our snapshots have been snapshotted, so we have our snapshots basically created. Cool. All right, now we're just going to do something interesting. We are going to update a record to complete. The record initially had processing. We're going to update it so that we can basically see how Snapshot works in real time. Snapshot will typically add a few columns to your record, but I want us to see this in real time. So we're just going to run this DBT snapshot again, so that this time around, because the first thing that happens is that when the initial run happens, DBT creates a snapshot table. It includes all the table from the select statement, and then it adds 4 meta fields, and then also it updates the DBT value to null. However, in our case, it's not going to be null. It's going to be the value we put in DBT value to current for the most current. So it's going to be null first, but after you run the second time, then the most current value is now going to be what we have there, and then the previous value is now going to be the value of the dates where we had our DBT snapshots updated. Cool, we just run that. So we're going to copy the name. What we want to do now is, I hope you know that we cannot, I already said this, that we cannot rebuild our snapshots. We cannot also preview them, but we can be able to select from them. So we're going to open analysis, where we're just going to open the snapshot and see. So I'm just going to copy the actual ID of the one I have updated in the past, so that we can use that to see exactly what happened when the DBT snapshot was run the second time. So let's just open it and copy the ID 41679. Yep, just copy that. Perfect. Paste. And then we are going to preview. Save first before preview. Perfect. So you can see our records and see the ID of what we selected, and then you can see the other status. So you can see the previous one, which is processing, and the most current complete. And then scrolling all the way, you can now see the 4 new records that DBT have added. The ID, which is unique, and then we have the updated timestamp, which is the day it was updated. You can see today's date, and then you can see the value from, and then value to. So you can look at the value to. You can see now that the most current one has the timestamp that we included in our DBT value to in the creation of our snapshot. So let's just open that again and see. Yeah, basically. So this is it here. So scroll down again. So this is it here. So basically it would have been null, but because we put in this value when creating our snapshots, that is why it now shows us something different. All right, cool. So we are going to move on to the next topic. DBT supports model governance to help teams control access to models, and to be able to also control the way they want their model to be in terms of the data type, the exact data type they want it to be when it is materialized in the data warehouse, and even models that can be referenced by other models as well. It's really important to know though that model governance is only specific to models, so it do not apply to other resources like snapshots that we talked about just now. All right, moving forward, contracts are basically like an upfront guarantee that defines the shape of your model, how exactly you want your model to be. And this basically is different from test, and I'm going to show you how it differs from test. Now, let's say we're going to be using this model to be able to define contracts in your model. The model must be, so the model can be materialized as a view or incremental or table, but you should know that if it's materialized as a view, some data warehouses do not support some constraints. For example, I'm working with BigQuery currently, and BigQuery you can define not null, primary key, and foreign key. However, it only enforces not null. So you might want to check the data warehouse if you're working with Redshift, Snowflake, any data warehouse. You might want to check that. And also for your incremental models, you also want to be sure that your on schema change is defined as fail. Or I think one more, I'm not sure I think I could just think about that. I think your on schema change has to be equal to be set as append new columns or fail. This is because you know that when you configure your incremental models, you have to configure how you want your model to react when there are changes to the schema. So these are the only two conditions that you can be able to define contracts for that specific incremental model. All right. To define our contract, we are going to go straight to the YAML file. Now we are going to come here. Now we have our other items, and I'm just going to say config. I'm going to set, because you define it under your config. So we're going to have config, and then the next thing we're going to have is we're going to have contract. So earlier you saw when I had to and first earlier you saw when I disabled the singular model I had created. So basically in the same way, this is basically how you do this. So first, I think you probably need it. Yeah, correct. All right, enforce true. So now we have our contract set up. So we have config contract enforce true. So now to be able to enforce it for this specific model, we have to now go to all the column types. Now, very important, you have to make sure that you're also listing all the columns, else it's going to give you an error. I think one of the things we should do is try out a time where it doesn't, and then you see how it reacts. So let's say data type, this is an integer. So I'm just going to copy it for all the integer data types so that I can move quickly. Then we have other ID. Other ID is an integer as well. Then username, user ID, sorry. Other status. So other status should be string if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Then we have the inventory item ID. Okay. Then created at. This should be timestamp. So I'm just going to copy this. Going to save. Then define it for all of them. So you're basically defining the contract, how exactly you want this model to be when it that's the field that this model contains, how exactly you want them to appear. So something I want to quickly do is that I want the first one to fail. So I'm going to remove the price. So the price is actually a float. I'm going to remove the price. I'll just take that off. We'll put it back later. So save. So I remove the price so that we can really see how contracts work, because like I said, it's an upfront guarantee exactly how you want it. So you're going to check the columns, it's going to check everything, the data types. So what I'm going to do now is that I am going to build specifically select, I'm going to build this model. That is our other items model. So because I copied this, I didn't want to lose it. All right, but that's fine. I think I could just I can put that later. So we're going to run this now and see how it actually works. So we can see dbt build select this specific other items model, which is the one that we've just implemented a contract for. So let's run it and see how what it's going to give us. Perfect. Let's see. Perfect. So you see that it says compilation error, and then it says please ensure the name, the data type, and the number of columns in your contracts match the columns in your model's definition. This is because dbt does like a pre-flight where it checks that the contracts that you have defined and the transformation that you have done, there's going to be a match. So when it's not matching, then it's going to fail. However, if it matches, then it's going to pass. And that's one difference with test, because your test is done after your model built. But you can see that your contract is like upfront during the building phase, but however, it's done before the model is actually built. So if it fails, then the model is not going to go ahead and build. So now let us quickly just let us put back that. So what's name sale price, and then data type float. So let's save this and run that model again and see what it gives us. So you can just use your up button and run. Perfect. So you can see that our model passed, and that is to say that we have successfully implemented a contract for this model. So you can be able to use this to implement contracts for other models as in. So model groups, in terms of model groups and access, model groups and access is specific to models. So when you hear it, don't think it has anything to do with user groups and user access. No, it specifically has to do with models. So you can basically be able to group your models on to be able to group models based on, let's say, for example, use case. If you are familiar with some of the best practices of naming your dbt project, my project is pretty small, so I do not have groups. However, let's say for example, under maths directory we have two subdirectory, finance and marketing, for example. You can see that if in that scenario now, what you will have is that models that are specific for finance use or models that are specific for marketing will be put inside that specific direction. So let me show you how you can be able to basically group your models, like aside from or naming the group. So because you can put them in subdirectories, but you did not name them to be in a group. So but if you want to put them to be named specifically under a group, you can do that in your dbt project YAML. You can also do it in your properties YAML as well. But let's see how we can be able to quickly do that. So let's say this is our model, this is our project, and let's go to maths directory. So now let us assume that we have two sub directories, right? So let's assume that we have let's say marketing. Let's assume that we have a marketing directory under math, and let's also assume that we have a finance directory under math. So if you want to now say, okay, all the models under the marketing directory under maths directory, I want them to be in the group marketing. What you can do is that you can just use your plus sign and you can say group, and then you can now give it the name you want it, that is marketing. And then you can do the exact same thing for finance. So you can say all the models that are under your finance directory, under your maths, they are in the group finance. Now, by default, all the models you have in a specific project, they have the access of protected. That is to say that if you have a model, let's say let's say you have a model here in Stack Overflow, and then you have a model here. The model here can reference the model here. Like any model can basically reference any model in your project. But you can also define your models to have the access private. When your model have access private, and let's say for example they are under the finance, they are under this finance what's it called, directory or finance group rather. If you have your model as private and it's under finance group, note that A model that is under marketing group cannot access the model. When you try to access it, you're going to have a passing error, and it basically is going to tell you that, oh, you cannot be able to access it. So let me see. I think the last thing I'm going to do is just basically show you how you can also be able to like do that in your YAML file. So I think I'll create a new YAML file for this to basically explain what you can be able to do. Let's create a new YAML file, and let's just call it grouping.yaml. So we're creating it under our staging. Let's call it grouping.yaml. So basically, this is how you do it. So the first thing you want to do is that you want to define your groups. Let me see if, oops, what happened here? No, yeah. So groups, yeah, perfect. So when you have to define your group. So what is the name of the group? So let's say our group is the finance group, and then the owner, you have to provide a valid email address as the owner. So let me just put my email. Yeah, okay. And then after that, the next thing you have to do now is your model. So you can now say models, and then you have your name. Let's say dim customers, or let's pick one that we have. Let's say users, copy name. So this model now, then we can now under our config define. So under config, we're now going to say group. So we're now going to say this model falls under the group, or is grouped as a finance model, and then we can now give it an access. So let's say the access for this model is private. Access for this model is private. So now that we've made it private, it means that any dependency, let's see the lineage for, let's open this model and see the lineage. Let's see the lineage for that particular model. So we have our staging e-coms users, and then it's feeding dim users, and it's feeding int others enriched. Now it means that if this model and this model, they are from, or they belong to a different group, if they belong to a different group or no group at all, they would not be able to access this model, because this model belongs to the finance group and it is private. However, if you make this public, then any model at all can be able to access it. So basically, that is all about model access. I hope that you were able to understand everything I explained. Please give me a thumbs up, give me a like, give me a comment if you followed us all the way to the end, and see you next time. Bye.